what this entity is explaining and describing, it's like it makes sense. It absolutely clicks, and it explains so many things about the nature of the universe. And like, why are we here? Why do I come into a human body and live a life? What's the purpose of it all?
Aaron Abke is a spiritual teacher that delivers a fresh perspective on metaphysics and ontology through his teachings on the Law of One, A Course in Miracles, and spiritual intelligence. In this conversation, we explore how the channeled text, The Law of One, offers surprising and profound insights into why our reality is unfolding the way it is right now, and how we can evolve to higher dimensions of consciousness.
The third density, they call it the density of separation. When the mind finally does that amazing thing where it kind of flips in on itself and becomes an object to itself and says, I am. I exist, and self-awareness is born. We know this is what makes humans unique animal species on our planet.
But this self-awareness comes with a crucial choice that each of us must make.
There are only two choices that anybody has in reality. You can choose to be what we would call a good person who cares about others, who's of service to others, or you can be a bad person and be selfish and live for yourself and harm other people to benefit yourself. There is a choice between light and dark, good and evil, and everybody has to choose which path they want. And until you choose, they say you just keep reincarnating back into the human earth plane because your soul hasn't gained a charge yet. So that explains a lot right there about the world we live in, is that we are in this density, third density realm to choose our polarity. And so once you choose a polarity, Ra calls that graduating to the next density.
Aaron explains to move to the positive polarity fourth density consciousness, we must focus on love.
If we focus on our differences, that's third density consciousness. We need to start focusing on our unity and our oneness with each other. And so love begins to awaken in the society as we move to the fourth density, which Ra says that our planet is essentially at that juncture of crossing over between third to fourth. And so we're kind of struggling to learn the lessons of love, that love is higher intelligence. Love is always the most intelligent response to any situation, because love brings balance, harmony, coherence, all the important things we need to create a good planet that we all want to live on.
And when we reach a tipping point, either positively or negatively, a soul has a choice to move on to a higher plane.
A human being must achieve 51% or greater service to others orientation in order to graduate. And the way I interpret that is, are you living from your heart about at least 51% of your life? Meaning you're operating from a mode of you really care about people and you're looking to help anyone you can help and bless people, and you want to be kind and extend love to people. Are you living like that at least 51% of the time? Well, if the answer is yes, you are eligible after this lifetime to go to a fourth density planet in a fourth density body. Interestingly, negative graduation requires 95% or greater service to self orientation.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Aaron, what's up, man?
Hey, brother. Thanks for having me today, man.
I'm honored to have you and really excited for this conversation. For me, we have a lot of shared experiences that we'll get into the episode. One of those experiences has been spending a little bit of time with the Law of One. That's something that you've gone very deep on and seems pretty fundamental, and something me that I have some exposure to, we'll put it. And so maybe we just start the jumping off there, and you could share for those that perhaps might not be familiar, what is the Law of One?
Well, the Law of One is what we call a channeled text from the 1980s, actually, 1980 through 84. It was channeled by a group of extraterrestrial researchers from the late 70s, early 80s. The organization is called L&L Research, and it was led by a guy named Don Elkins. who was a physicist, electrical engineer. He taught physics at university, very intelligent guy. And he was creating channeling groups for, I think, about 12 years before the law of one contact, where, you know, these people basically figured out very wisely, in my opinion, that you know, the UFO phenomenon was really picking up in those days. It was, you know, newspapers were talking about it, news headlines, UFO sightings all over the place. And so they were trying to figure out, like, what is this? What's going on? Who are these beings that are apparently flying around in our skies in these craft? And what they figured out wisely was, hey, if we really want to understand who these beings are and why they're here, we should probably get a lot more interested in their philosophy and spirituality than their technology, right? How they get here, are they using gravity propulsion or electromagnetic? You know, it doesn't really matter that much if you really think about it. I'm sure that they'll tell us once we become friends with them, you know? But like, why are they here and how do we go about establishing contact with them is a way more interesting question. And that's what LNR research was interested in. And so they correctly surmised that these extraterrestrial beings clearly are on a much higher level of consciousness and intelligence than we are. And so it stands to reason that they probably are communicating on a level of thought transference that's far above the primitive ape-like language that we use. So, like, if we want to talk to them, they probably don't speak in guttural noises like we do. They probably just speak mind to mind with telepathy and stuff. And so we could try and see if we could channel one of them. So they were trying this for about 12 years with very limited success. And, you know, learning the art of channeling is very difficult because you have to get yourself into a kind of self-induced hypnosis, a trance state, it's called, so that you can actually open your mind to receive a transmission. So it's very difficult to do and takes a lot of practice. But one of the girlfriends of one of the guys in the group, it was all men, and that was their first mistake. One of the girlfriends showed up to a channeling session and she was watching the channeling and she was like, wow, this is really cool. I want to learn how to do this. So they taught her how to channel, and classic, she became the best channeler in the group, like, right away. For some reason, women just tend to be better channelers than men across the board. So Carla was her name, Carla Ruckart, became the channeler for the Law of One because she actually got the raw contact on accident when she was teaching a student how to channel one day, a couple of years later. And Don Elkins was there and was listening to it. And he was like, oh my gosh, this sounds like a legitimate, you know, contact. So he set up a dedicated channeling group with himself, Carla, and then a third man named Jim McCarty, who's the only three of the three that's still alive today. He was the scribe. So he was listening to the channeling and transcripting it all and recording it on audio. So you can still listen to the audio recordings, the tape recordings from the 80s, which are very interesting to listen to. The channeling is very slow, like one word at a time, extremely long channeling sessions, but you can read it now on the lawof1.info website. And what they ended up doing was 106 channeling sessions over a 4-year period, where they kind of did a question and answer with this extraterrestrial entity, which identified itself as Ra. And so right off the bat, people who aren't as familiar with the occult art of channeling or mysticism or any of this stuff will find a lot of this weird and woo-woo. But what I appreciate about the Law of One is it's actually very scientific in its languaging, and the way that Ra, the entity being channeled, explains their view of the universe is very scientific, but also deeply spiritual and meaningful. So it's got the best of both worlds, in my opinion, and is just by far the most remarkable, the most unique, and the most profound channeling material I've ever come across. And that's saying a lot because I read a lot of channeled works. When I found it in the late around 2017, 2016, I just couldn't believe what I was reading. I'm like, this is just incredible material, because what this entity is just explaining and describing, it's like it makes sense. It absolutely clicks, and it explains so many things about the nature of the universe. And like, why are we here? Why do I come into a human body and live a life? What's the purpose of it all? the law of one gives exquisite answers to those kinds of questions.
And, I know that a lot of people here who maybe haven't read channeled works, even though we've talked about things like A Course in Miracles on this podcast, will listen to this with a little bit of skepticism, right? But it seems like you had a very similar experience to the one that I had, where you encounter this information and there is a clear recognition that there's some major truth in it in a felt sense. But
Strong.
then there's also like, because inevitably some people are like, well, how do you know that someone just isn't making this up? Like the level of complexity, detail, and profundity of the information is something that a random woman would never be able to make up.
Oh my gosh. You could put together the 10 greatest minds in all of science, and they could never come up with material this incredibly remarkable, unique. And again, as we get into it, you'll see what I mean. Like the principles laid out are, on one hand, very simple. And you're like, yeah, that makes sense that the universe would work that way. And on the other hand, incredibly complex. And I mean, Ra gets into the mathematics, the science, the biology, the electromagnetism, the chemistry, like all of the scientific elements are touched on in some form all throughout the text. And so it very much validates both sides of the argument. Like this is why I actually love it as well, because when I was in I used to work at Google as a personal trainer, which we talked about before the show. And all my clients were software engineers, right? Very brilliant, very left brain software engineer type guys. And so I would talk to them about the law of one as I was reading it in those days and explain the physics and metaphysics of the universe through the book. And they would listen very curiously. And a lot of it, they were like, that makes sense. And I'm like, this is pretty cool. I'm getting like the highest level elite software engineers in the world to listen to this. And they're like, that kind of checks out. I can't verify any of that, but like what you're saying seems to make sense. And since those years, dude, at retreats, at events, I'm constantly encountering people who come from very scientific backgrounds who find my channel on YouTube or whatever, and they dive into my law of one material and they're like, dude, I always pushed away the woo-woo spiritual nonsense stuff. It's just, it's cringy. I hate it. Not scientific. And when I came across your material on the law of one, it's like you're still teaching the same woo-woo principles, but through this very scientific lens. And I actually really resonated with it. And I actually fell in love with the law of one because of its scientific angle that it takes. So that's why it's also a very unique text, in that it doesn't push away intellectuals and just ask you to accept things at face value. It gives you a lot of context through science to say, yeah, this actually does check out with the science we have today. And then thirdly, a lot of the things back in the 80s that Ra says weren't confirmed yet in those days, like certain things about cosmology especially, that have now been confirmed only in recent years, that totally vindicates what Ra was saying back in the 80s. And I haven't found one thing in the law of one that Ra says which could be debunked by science or discoveries we have. So it's interesting, right? I always look at these things with a skeptical eye, because I don't want to believe something that's not true either. But you also have to pay attention to how much you resonate, like beyond the level of mind. Something in you kind of knows when you hear the truth, because again, it connects and interfaces perfectly with the world you experience if it's true. And that's the feeling of resonance that we describe, is somewhere in our subconscious mind, a part of us is saying, this fits into the reality I experience.
I completely agree. And I think more and more people are kind of learning to access and trust that inner wisdom, which is an incredibly important thing for the time we live in.
Yeah.
The other thing I would just add before we get into a little bit to the science is the thing that I found very fascinating about the law of one too, is it mentions many things that have become part of our pop culture that were way ahead of that happening.
Right.
For example, I remember the Men in Black reference, and I was like,
yeah,
holy shit. Like
way before the Men in Black movies.
100%. There's all of these cultural tie-ins that manifested after the work was produced, which, indicate there's something there. There's something interesting there.
I just got to give you one more. There's a couple I could mention, but one, probably the best one, is in one of the early sessions, they're asking Ra about the UFO phenomenon and all this stuff. And Ra tells them that your government, the American government, is currently in possession of a couple hundred of these craft, and they've been back engineering them so that they can create their own UFOs and stuff. And Ra says this in so many words. And Don says, hold on. I'm sorry. I don't mean to insult you or anything, but you can't expect me to believe that our government has UFO craft. I mean, no one will take this book seriously if we publish this. Should we take that part out of the text, Ra? And Don is like not for a second does Don believe Ra, right? But then what have we learned in the last 3 to 5 years, in America, especially with the Twitter files and all this stuff? We've learned beyond any shadow of a doubt, our government has actually told us we are in possession of off-world vehicles, and many whistleblowers from the military and the Air Force have come out saying like, oh yeah, America's got lots of different craft that they've been back engineering for since the 50s, actually, since Roswell, long before the Ra contact. So again, it's like what Ra said in the 80s that Don couldn't believe was true. We now know for certain is true. And that's one of the many things in the text like that, where you just go, wow, this is pretty remarkable.
100%. Another one that comes to mind is just the anomalies that have gotten so much more attention in places like Egypt, where there's these questions around like, there's no possible way that a human could have carved, the stones this big for a pyramid. And, maybe we'll get into Ra's explanation for that. But let's ground this in kind of like the current experience that we're all having. So I think one of the fundamental concepts is that aligns to the scientific paradigm is around density. Yep. And the fact that we're in these different densities. And so I'd love to hear you explain that and highlight what we're in now and where we might be going.
Sure. The densities is definitely the first place probably to start with the law of one and understanding the basic philosophy of the universe that the law of one lays out. And so Ra, by the way, the reason that they, and I say they because what Ra really is they identify themselves as a sixth density social memory complex, which a social memory complex is like a fancy way of saying a group mind. And the law of one explains that as civilizations evolve in the universe beyond third density into the fourth, right now we're in third density on our planet, moving into the fourth. In mid to late fourth density, the phenomenon of the group mind starts to form, which is when telepathy evolves, when we can read each other's minds thought to thought. And the love and the unity between the civilization is strong enough that love is like a metaphysical power that binds and connects things together. So when humanity is living in love and genuinely cares for one another, that will start opening psychic abilities like telepathy, because those abilities depend on being connected to somebody, right? So if you hate people, judge them, think ill of them, you're creating a disconnection in your mind from being able to do things like telepathy. So at some point in our civilization, maybe 1,000 years from now, maybe more than that, telepathy will evolve on a collective level and will begin evolving. And at some point, when we can all read each other's minds, we're basically one mind at that point, right? We all have access to everybody's thoughts. And so we become like a sort of Akashic records of humanity as a collective. And so Ra calls that phenomenon the social memory complex, because every memory of every human that's ever lived is now accessible to everybody. So it's kind of like, again, like an Akashic Records library, where we really kind of melt together into one kind of larger being, which is the social memory complex. So Ra is the civilization from the planet Venus from a couple of billion years ago. And this was another one of the things they validated, that they said a couple billion years ago, Venus was the most habitable Goldilocks type of planet in our solar system. And so we evolved on Venus back in those days in our third density lifespan. And our planet, Venus is one planet closer to the sun than we are. And so they said our planet was harshly bright compared to yours and much more difficult to survive on because of the large fluxes in temperature and things, right, with the sun. And so because their planet was harder to survive on than ours, they didn't have the luxury for tribalism and barbarism and warfare and division. It's like unite or die, right? If we don't work together to figure out how to live on this planet, we're all going to get cooked and stuff. So they said because our planet was more difficult to survive on, it was strongly unifying for our civilization. So they actually evolved extremely fast compared to us. They said your planet is kind of the opposite. You're in the perfect zone from the distance from the sun, where your planet is an absolute heaven on earth. It's paradise on your planet. And so, because your planet doesn't struggle with large temperature fluctuations every day and all this stuff, you guys have the luxury to fight over land and form tribes and fight each other, which we didn't have. And so, your planet is evolving much slower than ours.
Can we talk about, by the way, how the three body problem essentially shows this a planet that exists like that? I don't know if you watched that show, but it was like you know, people would burn up or they would freeze based on the positionality of the sun. And so it's like, again, pop culture referencing a potentially existent truth that is in the raw material.
I actually read those books back when I worked at Google in 2017, 2018. I absolutely could not put them down. They were the best science fiction books I've ever read. And so what it validates is that back when Ross said that in the 80s, we had no evidence, NASA or any kind of astronomy had no evidence yet that Venus was a habitable planet 2 billion years ago. But I'll never forget, September of 2019, NASA dropped an article that said scientists confirmed that Venus was in the Goldilocks zone 2 billion years ago and most likely had life and oceans and all the stuff we have for a long time, hundreds of millions of years. They had life on their planet for sure. And I said, look at that. The law of one, once again, is validated for something it said, 30 some odd years ago, which is really cool. But back to the densities. So the law of one lays it out like this. Everything is light, which we kind of know already is true through physics, quantum physics. Everything is light in these different entangled quantum relationships. And so the universe works on a spectrum of density of light. And so right there, you're like, it's a pretty reasonable hypothesis. But they go way deeper. They say there's 7 basic or major densities of light, which are the 7 colors in the color spectrum. So when you look at a color wheel and you have that like rainbow of the colors bleeding into each other, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and repeat. He said that's like a fractal pattern that repeats all through the universe. It repeats in the musical scale. You have 7 notes on the musical scale. And then when you hit the 8th note, you begin the new octave, right? So they say the universe is like that. It's like the color wheel or the musical scale, in that after the 7th density is completed, the universe moves to the 8th or first density of the next universe. So every universe, explodes the Big Bang or whatever, and billions of years of life as that universe evolves through all 7 densities of the light spectrum, and then eventually coalesces back into the one point, and then boom, a new universe explodes and starts all over again. And Ross says every universe uses the data that was gathered in the previous universe. Every life form, planet, star system, galaxy, everything that occurred in that universe becomes sort of like the shared data that the next universe gets to use to create the new experiment. And on it goes, universes exploding and imploding out of existence forever, for all of eternity. And Ross says every universe coming into and out of existence is essentially like the heartbeat of the one infinite creator, which I think is just the coolest analogy in the whole text. But the densities also correlate to our 7 energy centers. If you are familiar with spiritual, mysticism, Hinduism, Tao, all these cultures have described the 7 energy centers. And so we have the densities in our bodies in miniature already and available in potential. But the density, what a density really is the rate of vibration of the photon, meaning how fast is the photon vibrating at that level. And so the first density is the density of beingness, they call it. So the density model shows the progression that consciousness has to move through. So consciousness being non-physical, being eternal and infinite, It creates the universe, the physical universe, and it begins as a first density life form. So that would be earth, water, fire, and air, the four elements. So this is where consciousness spends billions of years in the universe interacting with the four elements, right? Forming stars, planets solidifying, oceans forming, volcanoes, magma, wind, rain, storms, and planets take billions of years to solidify. And then eventually, at least on our planet, once ocean life formed, the first second density life form came into being. And the second density begins when there is an organism in the environment that can move around and interact with the environment, right? The first density is the environment. There's no organisms yet, right? Just the four elements. That's it. Second density is the elements plus life forms, individual life forms. So, second density of consciousness is everything from microbial life, insects, fish, plants, and animals. That entire spectrum is the second density. So the second density is when consciousness has to learn how to be an individual in time and space and survive and meet its basic needs and all this stuff. So consciousness must spend many, many more millions of years, maybe even billions, in the second density until eventually the photon is vibrating fast enough to move to the third density. And the third density, correlating to the third chakra, the solar plexus, we know in spirituality that the third chakra kind of represents the ego chakra. And so the third density, they call it the density of separation, because it's when the mind finally does that amazing thing where it kind of flips in on itself and becomes an object to itself and says, I am, I exist, and self-awareness is born, right? We know this is what makes humans a unique animal species on our planet, in that we are the only truly self-aware beings on our planet, meaning we mentally understand we exist, we can contemplate past and future, and we can stress and worry over past and future, which animals, insects, plants, etc., apparently don't have that problem. They don't stress about past and future. They're in the present because they're not fully self-aware yet. So there's a lot of benefits that come with self-consciousness in the third density. Technology, everything we see in the world today, in the human world, right, is the product of third density. But it also comes with a whole lot of downsides, which basically is the belief that we're all separate from each other. And it makes sense that that would have to be a natural progression of consciousness. At some point, if consciousness is going to move to understanding the infinite oneness of all things, it has to go through a period of wondering if it might be separate from everything, right? And so if I'm self-aware and I know that I'm this body, and you, Scott, you're over there in that body, it seems to imply separateness, right? So third density also brings incredible division, tribalism, war, separation, division. All the evils and calamities we've seen in our planet are due to third density consciousness and our belief that we're separate. And so after, a civilization spends however long suffering under third density consciousness, believing we're separate from each other, the photon finally is vibrating fast enough to move to the fourth density or fourth chakra, which we know is the heart chakra. And that is the density they call of love and understanding. And so before I go further, I want to go back to what a density is, because I left us off there. A density, again, represents how fast the photon is vibrating. So if I have two photons and this one vibrates 100 times per second, this one vibrates 100,000 times per second, well, this photon clearly has a much higher density of light, right? More concentration of light. It's vibrating faster. And so we know that light is essentially information. And so the more information consciousness is able to produce through the vibration, the more ability consciousness has to express itself. So that's why you can look at a second density life form, like your pet, your dog, or your cat, and there's an obvious, marked difference in your ability to express yourself versus your cat or your dog. Your dog or cat, although they have their own limited ability to express themselves, they could never write a symphony or paint a painting or write poetry or script a movie or write a song or anything that humans do that is normal to us. We have a way higher degree of self-expression than any other animal does on our planet. That's because we're at a higher density level than they are. But likewise, the fourth density is equally higher in expression than the third density. And so when we move to the fourth density, that's when we start to wake up to the fact that, yeah, we're all in different bodies. We come from different cultures. We have different skin colors, different genders. Yeah. But we are fundamentally all the same, right? We're fundamentally one with each other. We need each other. We depend on each other. We can never, ever create a world we want to live in if we focus on our differences. That's third density consciousness. We need to start focusing on our unity and our oneness with each other. And so love begins to awaken in the society as we move to the fourth density, which Ra says that our planet is essentially at that juncture of crossing over between third to fourth. And so we're kind of struggling to learn the lessons of love, that love is higher intelligence. Love is always the most intelligent response to any situation because love brings balance, harmony, coherence, all the important things we need to create a good planet that we all want to live on. So we're really becoming more intelligent. You can think of it that way. But love is not necessarily an intellectual kind of intelligence, right? It's more of an intuitive, deeper kind of subconscious intelligence where you feel into and you feel the connection you have with everyone. And you understand that our connection to each other is the most important thing we have. And if we lose that, we lose everything. That's a fourth density way of thinking. And so, there's comparatively much fewer beings on our planet at that level of consciousness, right? Who are striving to create healing on this planet and love and overcome our differences. But it's growing by the day. There's a great awakening happening on our planet. And it's very indicative of this transition of humanity moving from third to fourth density consciousness.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness, the Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. That's amazing. And, I would say for the scientific folk out there that are interested in learning more about this, the Heart Math Institute has an incredible book called The Science of the Heart that details the intelligence of the heart in a way that also relates to this concept of information. The heart is the only place that I think is scientifically documented where people can seem to have precognition and access to information beyond space and time.
Oh, yeah.
And this isn't,
the CIA has definitely proven this.
Yeah, this isn't some bullshit. This is like, there's real hard evidence behind it. And it's amazing to see this innate ability and inner wisdom come online for a lot of people. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Aaron, is there is this distinct polarization that occurs at third density that is playing out in front of a lot of our eyes right now. And a lot of us lack a framework to make sense of it. And I think the raw material has a really insightful way that can put all this into context.
It sure does, brother. And that's why I love it. It just explains so many things we see in our world in a way that you go, okay, it's all going to be fine. This is the way it's supposed to be. It's part of the progression. Nothing is going to hell in a handbasket. God's still in control, but you do need to understand the metaphysical laws we're working with to make sense out of the world we see. And so I think what you're getting at is the choosing, right? In third density.
Exactly.
Yeah. So this is the other really cool scientific aspect of the framework for the universe that the Law of One lays out, is that it works essentially exactly like the quantum world, quantum physics works, in that every quantum particle we know has to have a charge, positive or negative, before it can do what's called work in physics. Work, that term in physics, means the ability to create change in your environment or influence your environment. So, unless a particle has a charge, it can't influence the environment at all, right? It has no ability to influence the environment until that charge is developed. So, protons, we know, have positive charges, electrons have negative charges, and so forth. So, Ra says that that's how humans are too, and that our very consciousness we have to choose which polarity we prefer, positive or negative, and that every density has a specific goal that consciousness is trying to accomplish through that density. And it's basically learning certain types of lessons more than anything, lessons about the nature of reality. But in third density, they say third density is very unique in the seven because it's kind of, for many different reasons, it's kind of a wild card type of density. And the first reason for that is this thing they call the choosing. So once you become self-aware, I exist. It's like you just popped into the universe as a self-aware particle, but you still have no charge. You're neutral, right? So the next thing, now that you exist as an individual particle, self-awareness, now choose your charge, positive or negative. And so that's what every human being, every soul in the universe has to do in third density, is you have to choose which path you prefer. And this is where the spirituality aspect comes in. From the scientific lens, we would say you must choose between the positive polarity or the negative polarity. But it's like, what does that mean though? How does that practically apply to my life? And so the spiritual side of that is it means you must choose between love or separateness or fear or whatever word you want to use. Light and dark, right? Good versus evil. And so and this makes sense, right? From a just pure philosophy sense. There are only two choices that anybody has in reality. You can choose to be what we would call a good person who cares about others, who's of service to others, etc. Or you can be a bad person and be selfish and live for yourself and hurt others and harm other people to benefit yourself. But that's really the only two choices. And you're always somewhere in between those two choices. There isn't a third option between those two. And so as we progress as human beings, we learn life lessons, we grow up and have families. If you really think about it, every single experience that a human being has in a human lifetime is essentially urging you to choose which of those two polarities you want to operate from. And for a long time, we remain in the sinkhole of indifference, right? Where sometimes we're choosing the positive, we're being loving and kind to others. But a lot of the time, we're choosing the negative and being super selfish and full of ego and stuff. So we're not really choosing yet. Because Ra says, in order to really become polarized, positive or negative, you do have to become aware of this choice, right? There is a choice between light and dark, good and evil. And everybody has to choose which path they want. And until you choose, they say you just keep reincarnating back into the human earth plane because your soul hasn't gained a charge yet. So that explains a lot right there about the world we live in, is that we are in this third density realm to choose our polarity. And so once you choose a polarity, Ra calls that graduating to the next density. And so they actually give us the exact numbers of polarization, percentages of polarization that are required to graduate to either polarity. And so what's interesting is they say a human being must achieve 51% or greater service to others orientation in order to graduate. And the way I interpret that is, are you living from your heart about at least 51% of your life? Meaning you're operating from a mode of you really care about people and you're looking to help anyone you can help and bless people and you want to be kind and extend love to people. Are you living like that at least 51% of the time? Well, if the answer is yes, you are eligible after this lifetime to go to a fourth density planet in a fourth density body, which, in layman's terms, basically that means you're eligible to become like an extraterrestrial being on an advanced planet somewhere, right? The extraterrestrials we see in UFOs in our skies are probably fourth density beings for the most part. So it's like, hey, you don't have to come back here again if you don't want to, type of thing. So that's positive graduation. Interestingly, negative graduation requires 95% or greater service to self orientation. And you go, wait a minute, that doesn't seem fair. Why is it so much harder on the negative polarity? And the answer is, and Ra gives this answer, that it's actually not harder to reach 95% negative polarization than it is to receive 51% positive polarization. Ra says those are both equally challenging accomplishments. And the reason for that is we have a programmed, negatively polarized driving force in our brains called the human ego that is constantly beckoning us to be selfish and look out for number one and fight to get to the top, right? And Darwinian kind of evolution, survival of the fittest. And so we have a software program called ego that's driving everyone to be selfish. And so it's driving us essentially towards the negative polarity. So if you want to graduate to the positive polarity, which everybody listening to this show most likely does, then you've got to overcome the ego because it's always trying to push you to the negative. So it's actually just as hard to reach 51% positive as it is 95% negative. But then the other reason for it is because the positive polarity is the polarity of unity. Unity is harmonious, it's strong, it's coherent. And so when you are on the positive polarity, everyone's looking out for each other's best interest. It is the strongest possible civilization, the most harmonious civilization. It's like a colony of ants, right? Or bees or something, where everyone's working for the highest common good of all. The negative polarity is the polarity of separateness. And so Ross says it is a very difficult polarity to progress on. Because on the negative polarity, you're fighting everybody else. There's no unity. It's every man for himself. It's king of the hill, right? And so they say in the negative polarity, there's always a pecking order. It's a pyramid, right? A hierarchy. And there's one very powerful being that controls the top of that pyramid, that every other being is serving that overlord in some way, but they're all trying to get higher and higher up the totem pole. And then eventually the entities that are just beneath the overlord will try to overthrow it and take power, right? So there's a nonstop fight for power. So Ra says the negative polarity is kind of always unraveling and recreating itself, which I go, look at that. Isn't that exactly what we see on our planet, right? All through time, military commanders and dictators do exactly this. In every country in history, there's constant overthrow attempts, coup d'etat attempts. You know, people that are moving towards the negative polarity, they just want power. They don't care about anything else. Power is the reason that gives meaning to their existence. And so everyone's fighting for power. Even Hitler, there was overthrow attempts from his own Nazi commanders who wanted to take him out and take his position. So we see this on our planet, that it does work this way. If you choose the negative path, you're alone, dude. You got to fight to get to the top all by yourself. Whereas the positive brings this kind of natural protection and unity and harmony with it, which makes it easier to polarize on. So that also explains why the 51 versus 95%.
You know, I'd love to share a few reflections here that come up for me. So I think the first is that when I have a conversation with people about what's going on in the world, a lot of them are like, well, no one's actually evil. It's just there's a lack of awareness that they're hurting other people. And I think what or like, you know, there's just one bad guy, right? And like, I think that the raw material elegantly describes this phenomena, which is that there is a consciousness that is in service of self instead of service of whole.
Yeah.
And in that service of self, there's a perception that they're doing the right thing.
Of course.
Because they're serving self. And so that's how you could explain how the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, for example, just pushes something to market that is terrible for lots of people. Like they know, but they also perceive what they're doing as the right thing because it's in the sense making of service to self.
Right.
And if you want to call that evil, like, cool, maybe that's a word you could use for that. But like the raw material, like tells us exactly what's happening right now.
Yes. That's an important nuance, because we do project onto evil people that they're like mustache twirling villains who just love to cause harm, and they hate people and they revel in the suffering of others. And it's like, we have to accept that that's a cartoon caricature of what evil is, right? Nobody actually thinks like that. I just love killing people and doing harm. Hee hee. That's not what an evil person is like. An evil person is very sophisticated in their thinking, right? They're very wise and intelligent, and they've rationalized everything they're doing. And if you told them they were doing evil, they would look at you like, what? Whatever do you mean? So they have good reasons for what they're doing. Everybody feels justified in what they do. This is a undeniable fact of a human experience. Even a serial killer feels totally justified in what they're doing. That's why they do it, right? If someone felt not justified in what they do, they don't do it. The serial killer says, well, I've been abused, I've been hurt, I've been abandoned, people have, treated me unfairly, so why don't I dish out some punishing to others and see how they like it? There's a rationale in the mind of the person. So everybody feels right from their perspective. And so the negative polarity, Ra says that in order to polarize to the negative, you have to shut off the heart chakra, basically completely, meaning you can't feel empathy for other people, or you can't polarize to the negative. And so what the negative polarity part of it is, and this is also seen on full display in all the dark occult arts, black magic, Freemasonry, any of these kind of like Luciferian dark spiritual paths, they're all built on these core tenets. I studied Freemasonry, for example, for a little while to learn more about the negative polarity. And I'm well aware that there are good branches of Freemasonry, so I don't loop everyone in on the dark Freemasonry, but there is a lot of dark Freemasonry on our planet. And if you read some of these Freemason handbooks, it's pretty remarkable the way they order the different ranks. Like we know in Freemasonry, there's 33 degrees, right? You can earn. And I remember reading when you start as a Freemason, it's very mild and domesticated. And it's like a spiritual gentleman's club. Come and learn about self-empowerment and the power of the mind. And yes, spiritual empowerment. And so it attracts a lot of people. And then as you go through the ranks, slowly but surely, they ask you to do things. If you want to get to the second level, the third level, the fifth level, the ninth level, there's always something else you have to do to graduate to the next degree. And by the time you get into the late 20s, it's like slit the throat of a pig and watch it bleed out and die and feel no remorse about it. That's an actual practice I read in a Freemason textbook. Kill a pig, feel no remorse. And eventually it probably is like human sacrifice and stuff like that, right? At the highest levels. So they're testing you of how much can you desensitize yourself to your connection with others. And that's how you gain power on the negative polarity. And so they feel as if, are you familiar with a philosophy called Solipsism?
I've never heard of it.
Oh, you haven't? Okay. Solipsism is, do you know what non-duality is?
Yes.
Okay. I call it dark non-duality. Solipsism is the belief that I'm the only true sentient being in all of existence. Everyone else that seems to be another sentient being is really just like a dream character in my mind. The whole universe is just my mind, right? So no one's really out there. So the universe is just for me to do whatever I want and make it my own playground and kingdom to conquer and take power over and put into order how I see fit, right? That's solipsism. That's the negative polarity. So the positive polarity and the negative actually have a lot of agreement on the laws of the universe. Both the positive and negative polarity say, yes, all is one. There's only one being in the universe. They both agree on that. And in fact, I sometimes like to paint this kind of interesting picture of, imagine if you could get a fifth or sixth density positive being and a sixth density negative being to sit down at a table and have a conversation about the nature of the universe. How would that conversation go? And most of us think, oh, they would disagree about everything, clearly. And the interesting thing is, no, actually they wouldn't. They would agree on most of the same tenets. They would both agree on the physics and metaphysics of the universe, because the negative path basically shuts off the heart and uses the brain solely. The negative path relies on intellect, intelligence, wisdom, cunning, deception, craftiness, all the stuff we see that the negative polarity on our planet uses against people. And so they would agree on many of the same tenets, but where they would disagree is that the positive being says, because all is one, there's only one being in the universe. You could call it God if you want. You could call it consciousness, whatever. There's only one essential being in existence. And so because there's only one being, everybody is me. Everyone I see, everything I see is another version of me. It's all just me here. And so I should love everyone as myself. As Jesus said, right? The greatest commandment of all is love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, if you do this one thing, if you follow this one law, you fulfill the entire law and the prophets of the Old Testament. So it's called the law of one. That's what the law of one means. It means all is one. And so love is the highest truth of the universe. But the negative being would definitely disagree with that. The negative being would say, no, no, no. All is one means I'm the only being in existence and everyone else is an illusion. So there's no other me out there. There's just thoughts. There's just images in my mind, like a dream, right? You don't wake up from a dream and feel bad about something you did to a dream character. They weren't real. It's just a figment of imagination in your mind. So that's where the two polarities disagree with each other. And so that's why you get the service to others path, they call it, and the service to self path.
I'm so happy we're covering this distinction, because I think it just can really help put things into perspective as people explore this different information. And I also think it kind of debunks this concept of, the evolution of consciousness is becoming just means like becoming a light, open-hearted being. If you look at different models of consciousness, whether it's David Hawkins or spiral dynamics or Ken Wilber, it kind of just talks about that from the service of others path, mostly, right? Yeah. And it doesn't explain how we can have these brilliant beings controlling the world that clearly are not living from the open-hearted state.
Yeah.
And also, by the way, how there could be extraterrestrial beings that also aren't living from that place, which, there does seem to be some people and evidence that are indicative of that.
Yes.
And so like, I think it's just a really important idea for people that like, yeah, like like Earth is evolving, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to evolve into a place without polarity where everyone is just in love with each other.
Yeah. Not at first.
I'd be curious. Yeah. I'd be curious kind of like how you relate to that idea that I think is so popular, which is like, we're experiencing this evolution of consciousness and Earth is going to be a paradise soon. Like, or I'm sure you know what I'm referencing.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And there's some truth to that for sure. We will get to the point of becoming an enlightened civilization at some point. But we have to remember the fractal nature of the universe, that everything is a microcosm of the macrocosm. And so the same exact way that spiritual evolution works for an individual is exactly how it works for a planetary civilization. So how does spiritual evolution work for an individual? Well, does it happen all at once? Is it a quick process? Not for most of us, right? It's a daily, ongoing practice of every single day. I try to overcome my ego and pride a little bit more and become a little more loving, a little more open-hearted, a little more kind and patient and humble. It's a process. It takes time. And for most of us, it takes our whole life, So a planet is no different in that just like a person has to choose a charge, positive or negative, every planet becomes charged as well. But the charge that the planet takes depends upon the collective consciousness of the planet, of every person on the planet. So basically, remember I said 51% is the graduation point for the positive? Well, it's also the graduation point for planets on the positive. So what that means is once 51% of human beings on the planet are living from the heart more than not, are in that fourth density frequency, then the whole planet becomes officially fourth density positive. So that's a process. And they actually ask Ra, how long will that process take for our planet to become officially fourth density positive? And Ra says, our estimations, because apparently in the sixth density, you have access to future, there is no future, but future timelines of humanity's history, and they can run projections of here's the possibilities we're seeing, and they call it a probability vortex or a probability vortices. And they say based upon the probability vortices, it looks like Earth will likely become fourth density positive between 100 to 700 years in your future. That's what they say. So that's not a quick, maybe, but it's kind of quick on the cosmic scale of time. And so we have to purge and heal our negative karma, our negative polarity on this planet. So just like we've seen, we're at the time of this recording, it's the day after the election. And a lot of us are happy because we've seen this election as a basic choice point between truth and illusion, right? On one side, we had a candidate who no one has ever criticized, Donald Trump, of not being himself or being fake or playing a fake character, right? Donald Trump gets criticized for being himself, for telling the truth too much, right? And then on the other side, whether it's Obama, Biden, Harris, we have these kind of plastic puppet politicians that are clearly reading a script that someone else wrote for them and not relatable or real or authentic at all, right? They only read off teleprompters and then they're off the TV screen. You didn't see, Kamala Harris, for example, doing all these long form podcasts like Trump did. And so the election for a lot of us was more of the choice between more of the same government tyranny and control, the illusion of power, or truth and reality, somebody that's not working for that deep state system, who they really don't like and have tried everything they can to kill, cancel, censor this guy for the last 10 years. So most of the population of America said, we choose truth. We choose uncomfortable truth over comfortable illusion, right? So we're seeing a consciousness shift happening on our planet, in that what I think is probably the first true populist candidate, who of course is not the perfect candidate by any means at all, but it's like humanity doesn't deserve the perfect candidate yet. We don't deserve the perfect candidate yet. We have way too much mess to clean up. We have to inch our way towards getting the perfect ideal candidate. And so the first step might look like somebody like Donald Trump, right? Who, for all of his flaws and his ego, at least he's honest and authentic about who he is. And people like that. To me, that represents this gradual shifting of our planet moving towards truth and the light. So this is going to keep happening on our planet. And I don't think that by any means this is going to be some golden age or something. I think the darkness on our planet is going to, what's the term? Count their losses, go regroup, and come up with a new strategy to take control. They're not going to give up. I mean, we know this. So we're not out of the woods yet, right? There's a lot more corruption to uproot on our planet, a ton more corruption. But that's part of the healing process. So at some point, humanity will be awakened enough. I mean, we have the internet and social media now, which is a massive catalyst for unity on our planet. And so we will get to the point of expunging the corruption from our planet. But I don't think that's going to be a likely reality less than a couple hundred years from now, in my personal opinion. And I could be wrong. But
that makes sense. So the way we can be conceptualizing this in the broader context of evolution is like the individual beings will be evolving to the fourth density, be it on the positive or negative pole. Right. And as that collective composition shifts towards the positive, which it seems like we're doing
big time,
right? Instead of being a failed civilization like Atlantis or something like that, will be perhaps maybe a longer, more prosperous, a longer lasting, more prosperous species on the planet.
100%. It's inevitable, but they ask Ra about this very thing as well of, is our this was back in the 80s, right? Before we started moving into the fourth density. And so they said, is our planet going to graduate to the positive polarity? And Ra says, essentially, yes, your planet is going to become a positive fourth density planet, but just barely. It's going to be a close graduation. And it's like, yeah, that feels about right.
Yeah, it does. Got to make it interesting, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, obviously, way more good-hearted people on our planet than there are people that are, their hearts are cold and cut off from others, and all they want is power, control. That's a vast minority on our planet. But the only thing is that vast minority has done a great job at centralizing power to themselves. And so although we outnumber them, 1,000,000 to 1 probably, the million of those compared to the one are poor, living in debt, living in poverty, don't have the money to compete with those people. So it seems like there's a huge power imbalance, because there is, but only because most people aren't awake enough yet, right? We have allowed this situation to happen on our planet. We have turned a blind eye to the corruption for decades on this planet. We have allowed the negative polarity people on our planet to get away with all their corruption. We haven't held them to account until now, right? When it got so bad over the last 4 years that at least in America, people started crying out for change and like, what do we have to do to heal and get over this? And finally, we can start creating some change once we can keep power accountable. If we don't keep power accountable, we will never have an enlightened civilization, because the nature of power is such that only the people with the most selfish intentions are going to seek out power, positions of power. And so it's like, yeah, maybe there's very few truly good people that would even want to be president of a country, because a truly good person doesn't really want to have that much power over others, right? But nevertheless, it's kind of like, well, we don't have a choice anymore. We need to get a good person in these positions of power, because otherwise the negative polarity is going to fill every position of power, every position of government and religion and science, you name it. They're going to fill those positions because that's all they care about is power. So it's like we actually need to want unity more than the negative polarity wants power. And I think until maybe now, if I had asked you, a few months ago, Scott, do you think that the good intentioned, well-meaning people on our planet crave and desire unity and love as much as the people in power crave power?
Absolutely
You probably would have
not.
said no, right? That's a pretty obvious one. We definitely don't want unity as bad as they want power. Until now, I'm seeing some tides shifting in our collective consciousness from this election. Just especially what a blowout election it was, a clean sweep of the executive branch, the House, the Senate, the popular vote. Trump and his team of mostly Democrats won everything. And so that means to me that the people have spoken their voice of, we want unity, we want to heal, we want to move forward, we don't want this anymore.
Man, I love how you translate these teachings into the broader unfolding of what's happening on a societal level. It's really amazing stuff, and really helpful for people to just understand, why is this stuff happening?
Yeah.
And it to me, this gets back to, I know you talk about this concept of spiritual intelligence in the wisdom tradition that I study in. Awareness, just the word is associated with the capacity to see true reality as it is. It's kind of similar to what you're talking about. And it's just so helpful to understand these fundamental laws of the universe, because it creates a framework to interpret things that are seemingly difficult or hard or bad or whatever it is. When you kind of have that, exactly, it's like when you have that basis of understanding the fundamental laws of things, it just creates such a better experience in my perspective.
I agree. It also creates a lot of hope, right? When you understand how things really work, then you understand what we need to do to create the world we want. And you're like, okay, we can do this. It's going to be tough, but I understand the path forward now. And that makes all the difference.
Exactly. And I think, one of those points that we can maybe just end on is this idea that for our evolution, we actually need that opposite pole
Yeah.
in order to become aware of ourselves.
Yes. Yeah, this is another one of my favorite topics from the Law of One, and one that I teach most heavily in my platform, which is called 4D University, is this concept of spiritual balancing. And so, what they teach about spiritual balancing is that the positive polarity uh, is equally neutral towards both polarities, meaning it adopts the same attitude towards the positive and the negative, which is that the positive doesn't just see other people on the positive as, my divine brothers and sisters, welcome. I love you. And then when it sees a negative being, it goes, evil, I hate you. You're so bad. Get out of my face. That's duality. That's not actually the positive polarity. The positive polarity looks at both beings and says, my divine brothers and sisters, both positive and negative. Because the positive path understands that the negative polarity is playing a role in the universe and is necessary. And so Ross says that about 90% of all beings in the universe, apparently, choose the positive polarity or graduate to the positive. So about 10% graduate to the negative. And so in this dichotomy we have in the universe, everybody has to be aware of how each polarity operates. If you want to stay invulnerable to the negative, you have to understand their strategies and the way they go about taking power. And so the important thing here is the concept of free will. Free will is everything under the law of one, because the positive polarity operates under the law of do no harm. That's the positive polarity. You can think of it as do no harm. If I want to graduate to the positive polarity, I have to make sure I'm not doing harm to others. I have to actually want to be of service to others. And so not infringing on free will is huge for positive graduation, meaning you got to have the ability to let people be where they are and not try to force your beliefs down everybody's throat and convert everybody all the time. That's not the right attitude. That's a kind of infringement. If somebody doesn't want to change their beliefs, if they're perfectly happy with what they believe, why try to change their mind? And you can't, even if you wanted to. So the positive doesn't go around trying to change people's mind. The positive polarity goes around trying to radiate that love and light of the creator so that other beings can feel the love and light that you embody and say, I want some of that. How do you have this happiness, this joy, this love, this lightness to your personality? What are you doing, man? And then you can share with somebody, your spiritual practices, your beliefs and stuff, once they're open to it. But if they're not open and you try to shove it down their throat, that's infringement. So the positive polarity polarizes more positive by honoring and protecting free will. That's huge to understand. The negative is the opposite. The negative polarizes by infringing on free will. But the key is the negative can only infringe on someone's free will at the other person's approval, meaning they have to deceive the other person to giving them some of their free will and power in order to actually polarize more negative. Meaning that like a negative extraterrestrial race, let's say, could not gain more power by coming to our planet and throwing all of us in cages and making us their slaves against our will. They would actually lose polarity, believe it or not, if they did that. Because the law of free will is such a critical component of the law of one. We are all free beings. And so if you violate somebody's free will, you're going to pay a consequence for that in some way. So the negative polarity has to gain the free will of others freely. And so that's why they rely upon deception, manipulation, sleight of hand, illusions, trickery, all of that, propaganda. That's how they have to do it. And here's where we see a bunch more parallels in our world, is that actually one of the most difficult challenges for the negative polarity to overcome is karma. The law of karma, which says if you violate somebody's free will, you yourself must be violated to the equal measure that you violated someone else. And yeah, it'll usually come in a different shape or form, but you will get your free will violated at some point if you do it to others. That's the law. And so what they do to avoid that karma is that they always have to sort of tell you what they're going to do and get you to agree and acquiesce to it. Because if they get your agreement, now it's not a violation as far as the universe is concerned. And you might say, well, come on, Aaron, but that's not fair either, because the people being manipulated, they don't know they're being manipulated, right? It's like, that's true. So it's still wrong morally. But the fact is, we live in a no victim universe, meaning the intelligence of the universe doesn't hold your ignorance against you. It counts your ignorance against you. Like, just because you're not aware of something doesn't mean you get a free pass. You know, we're supposed to learn and grow. So it's like, you need to be aware when someone's trying to manipulate you. And if someone is manipulating you and you're not aware of it, and they trick you into giving them your free will in some way, it's like, sorry, it was a lack of your own awareness. So you're going to pay the price for that. And you paying the price for it is how you learn, right? It doesn't feel good to be taken advantage of. And so, as you said, Scott, there's the purpose for the negative polarity, is that the negative polarity is the catalyst that forces us to choose the positive, to choose love, because otherwise we continually get sucked into the tricks of the negative polarity. And we have to live in that kind of world, which, that kind of communist, tyrannical, dystopian world that none of us want to live in. That's what they want to create. And they're going to keep trying to trick us into agreeing with that type of world. So the negative polarity thrives off of what I call false light, right? They're constantly touting virtue and using virtue to convince people. So it's a very clever strategy, right? To use people's light against them. Almost like a mirror, like shining your light in your face.
You want to be a good person? Get vaccinated. You want to be a good person? Do this, do that.
Agree to this or that.
Yeah, it's incredibly cunning, and awareness of it is the only path I see.
Yes. And that's what's happening, right? I mean, look at the awakening that the negative polarity that's been running our government for a long time. Look at what they've created. They have single-handedly destroyed legacy media forever. It's done, stone dead. It'll never be resurrected. We live now in the age of independent media because of them, because they tried to use mainstream media as this weapon against the population, and it woke the population up. People got sick of mainstream media and stopped watching it and turned to podcasts and independent journalism. And this has now created a totally new standard for our country, in that no president will ever be able to run for office again without doing podcast circuits like we saw Trump do. It's going to be the new normal now. So it's like, how can you say that that's a bad thing? That's a very good thing. But it came about through all the suffering that our government has created for us, right?
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, this has been an epic deep dive on the law of one, man. I so enjoyed you sharing your wisdom and exploring these topics with you. And I think, my hope is that this reaches some people in a way that helps them see things more clearly. I know you teach a lot of people directly through your channel and courses and platform, and I want to give you the opportunity to share more about that.
Yeah, thank you. I have a online platform, which is called 4D University. And it's essentially what I've tried to create is an online academy for the expansion of consciousness. So we teach all of these principles we've discussed today from the Law of One. I also love teaching from A Course in Miracles, which you mentioned, and some other modalities as well. But our whole goal is to teach people how to graduate to the fourth density in this lifetime. In other words, how to activate the heart chakra and live from the heart chakra. That's why it's called Fourth Density University. This is our one goal. And so if you resonated with our conversation today and you want to go deeper into these kinds of teachings, just go to 4duniversity.com. You can read all about what we do on our different membership packages. And we have a $44 membership that you can take 8 different courses on all these topics and really dive in deep into what we've been discussing today. So I'm sure we'll put all that stuff in the description below. Other than that, I got 500 some odd free videos on my YouTube channel you can also watch if you want to go deeper into these teachings as well. And that's just youtube.com/Aaron Abke.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll make sure to link those out in the show notes. Thanks again, man. This was such a wonderful time to spend with you. And thank you, everybody, for listening as well.
Thank you, brother. It's been a pleasure.
Be